Thank you all. Sorry to be interrupting your lunch. I know this is the part where has the dessert come out yet? I hope so. Um, okay. But basically, I have a PowerPoint which Mary and I talked about. So it may block me out. I'd actually rather be talking to you directly, but I don't know if I can have it both ways here. So I'm going to pull it up in a minute. But thank you very much for having me today. I appreciate it. I lived in Milwaukee area for more than 20 years. So I was hoping I'd get back and be with you in person, but I couldn't for family reasons. In any case, I am happy to be with you. So let me just see if I can. I don't know. I don't think I can share and be with you. Do you see me now still?
Yeah, we can see you.
You can. Great. Super. Okay, cool. All right. So Mary's already introduced me. I just wanted to, as I was getting ready for this talk, I realized I was involved with cable broadband since 1981, and I found my old dissertation. I pulled out a copy of my dissertation, which, as you can see here, which I won't make any of you read, don't worry, is on cable broadband communications, the control of information post-industrial society. And I had been doing cable work in the Bay Area, both community organizing with grassroots video in Berkeley. I founded one of the first cable news shows, local cable news shows in Berkeley, alternative news, and also worked to get funding for cable in one of the earliest bills in California, which is actually part of it in my dissertation too. So I do know what you all do. I really, really do. And as Mary said, I've also, I've lugged a camera and a lighting kit and around. So I've done this from multiple sides. So if you tire of my professor role, at least have a little sympathy for me, because I've been there too. So briefly, what are we going to do today? I'm going to have to keep an eye on the clock because my clock disappeared. Talk about the shape of Wisconsin's communication ecology and how it's changing. I'm going to put that in a little bit of context of national communication ecologies. I'll say a little bit about what that means. I want to talk about what holes this leaves and what problems it creates. And that's going to lead us to a brief discussion of community information needs, which Mary mentioned in the intro. And finally, very briefly, I'll address how I think cable access television might fit into this larger picture, hopefully leaving room for discussion. So briefly, Wisconsin's media ecology. I know that most of this is probably not news to any of you, but still there's been a major decline in newspapers in the state, both in quantity and quality, and not least of all in concentration of ownership. Sorry about that, which Gannett now owns the vast majority of the papers. Gannett and Lee own most of the papers in the state. And that's changed the ecology, not for the better. That's led to diminishing local news reporting across a whole range of media formats. Newspapers themselves, of course, but as many of you probably know from your local communities, newspapers end up news-wise essentially powering television. And sorry about that. Newspapers power television, and effectively when newspapers dry up, so does the supply of a lot of local reporting. We've also had a rise of talk radio, especially at the state level. I know Charlie Sykes is not doing that anymore, but when we started doing our research, he was an extremely powerful figure, and the shadow the role that he played still looms large in the state. And finally, of course, we now have social media as a primary information and organizing platform for many people, including politically. So we've been studying this for about 10 years now, ballpark. We've done field work, talked to citizens across Wisconsin in 27 communities. Now it's closer to probably 35. We systematically studied 400,000 articles from 29 local newspapers, and that's using computer methods, which I promised Mary I wouldn't get into the details of the methodology. Geeking out. If anybody's interested, we can talk about it in Q&A. We've studied Twitter. We've harvested talk radio. Many of you maybe know Charles Franklin's Marquette poll. He's been generous and shared that with us, and so we've organized 42 waves of his state opinion data over 10 plus years. We've done in-depth interviews with key media and political players and so on. We've studied campaign advertising, and this is just a quick look at what we've interviewed all over the state. This is old now. This is also at least a year, but what we've tried to be somewhat racially balanced. Not enough Latinos here. There's more here than there were at the time this was created, but across congressional districts and certainly across ideology as best as we could. So real briefly, this is the state of the political communication ecology in Wisconsin, which is kind of how we framed our work. We interviewed one woman named Anna in her late 50s in Milwaukee, conservative activist. Said, my brother's a liberal and he hates Governor Walker. He hasn't spoken to me in more than 6 or 7 times since the recall. He actually unfriended me and blocked me because I'm the enemy. I have the cooties really bad. Okay, he doesn't even want to be in the same building with me. I haven't seen my brother socially in like 8 years. So this is kind of the level of contention. And this quote sort of sums it up, which is why I included it, that we've been living in Wisconsin for, since 2010, essentially. 2011. And that's the environment in which our communication ecology has been evolving as well. This is a quote from Noah, who's also a conservative. For some reason, I grabbed a lot of conservative quotes today. No one trusts the news. Republicans don't trust it. Democrats don't trust it. When I talk to my Democrat friends in Madison, they turn around, and while we point at MSNBC, they point at Breitbart, with the same points and the same level of conviction. So that's a difficult divide. That's the divide right there. And I think this summarizes, really, we heard this from liberals, we heard this from conservatives and people in between. Even though there's a lot of contention politically, a lot of citizens at the ground level feel like they're not getting the information that they want, certainly about politics, but about many other things as well. And so I think that as we'll talk about as we go forward, that opens up and continues, I should say, an important role for local cable television. Really quickly, I'm going to step through the historical media ecology. These are old slides. I apologize. I didn't have time to redo these. So they're about almost 10 years old, which is embarrassing, but I decided to use them rather than not. So don't tell anyone. Basically, this is in the old days, this is essentially how things work, right? There was one large newspaper that was the satellite coverage of a metro. Then there were smaller newspapers and local dailies underneath it. Of course, there were TV stations, but this is kind of called the umbrella structure of the traditional American media ecology. This is just another probably more depiction of that. The so-called modern era, roughly 1950 to 1995. Pretty much most American communities, even smaller cities or smaller communities to big cities, had a newspaper, 2, 3, sometimes, rarely more than 3, 2 or 3 TV stations. They got news from AP, a couple radio stations, and local elite networks were the dominant source for news, and social networks were pretty much restricted to face-to-face and phone. So this is the way, I grew up. This is the way it has been in our country, in the United States since the post-war period. Then we reached the transitional era around it started in 1990, really. And it's not that different, but we start to get the rise of some social media, AOL, Yahoo, etc. Blogs started emerging, but still they didn't change the environment that much. But not by 2012, which is when I made these slides, and I apologize that cable access is not in here. It should have been, but I was mostly trying to capture social media when I made these slides. Even at a national level, we're now getting a really complex system emerging with multiple actors, multiple players across the news ecology, uh, multiple forms of competition, including entertainment, of course, which is always a form of competition for news and the communication ecology. We get the rise of Twitter, the rise of Facebook, the rise of personal social networks represented by those little personal N's at the bottom. So this is just the national picture, and the local picture, of course, is pretty much that complicated. And here, of course, we also have neighborhoods in which people are both talking to each other, and that they're now connecting to each other by Facebook. Today, we'd have probably Nextdoor on here and some other social media, but those would still be the two dominant ones. Twitter's an intermediary connecting news and so on. And outside institutions, including governments, are starting to generate their own news. So this is just a quick step through the way that the ecology has changed in the last basically 15 years quite radically. And of course, today this would even be more complex. Okay, so the other way that our research group makes sense of this is we talk about people's life worlds, which is really just their everyday lives, people getting up, going to work, having jobs, kids, healthcare issues, and so on. But that's the center of people's communication experience. They have personal networks that still play a critical role in how people make sense of the world and get news. We have a local layer, which is what we've just been looking at, a state layer, a national layer. Local news comes into social networks. People often, as you all know, on Facebook or elsewhere say, I saw this on TV, or I read this in the paper, or more recently, of course, I just saw this on Facebook. And then that starts to circulate. And of course, all these other sources are there. So this is a basic model of that we use in the communication ecology. So real just to summarize this, in Wisconsin, the news ecology is changing rapidly. Newspapers have declined. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, which used to be a statewide presence, declined almost 80,000 from circulation from 2000 to 2010, and it's continued. That's declined, not quite as steep. It's sort of leveled off a bit, but still, it's not the dominant paper that it used to be. And that was important in a way because it gave people a common page, literally a front page about state news and information that allowed them to orient themselves to just what's going on. Now, some people didn't like the Journal or the Sentinel, and now then they merged, of course, in the 90s, but still that was a common page. It gave everyone one source of facts that they could then debate what they meant. And of course, there was plenty of contention during that period. Governor Thompson was governor. There was plenty of back and forth between Democrats and Republicans, some of it pretty heated, but there was still more or less a common set of facts. Gannett purchased during this period more than 40 newspapers, and that led to deteriorating local news coverage and quality. One person we interviewed, a guy named Don, a firefighter, that's an alias, a pseudonym, I should say, not an alias. He's a firefighter in Oshkosh. He says, usually locally, I went to the Northwestern because it's gone now. I go to their website. So it's not gone, but that's the perception by this guy who's actually a union member and leader. And he's not disconnected from the news, but as far as he's concerned, the Northwestern barely exists anymore. And so that's true of a lot of smaller cities, especially across the state. Less true of Madison, Milwaukee, but for a lot of other places, their sort of local newspapers have shrunk almost to the point where people barely even recognize that they exist. This has led, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more shortly, to a radical cutback in state house news coverage. At the state house level, so it used to be that many newspapers, Green Bay had a man who was considered the dean of local of state house reporters in Wisconsin, so you didn't have to come from Madison or Milwaukee. We've seen the Racine Journal-Times had 2 correspondents covering Kenosha and Racine legislative delegations in Madison. This was in the 90s, and now those are all gone. There's basically, depending on how you count, 8 newspaper reporters covering the state house, and most of those are Gannett reporters. There are some nonprofit alternatives. Most importantly, I would say the Wisconsin Public Radio is the most important. The Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism also does a great job. And on the right, there's public policy news coming from state policy networks funded by the Bradley Foundation. But these are pretty pale when you've lost the local news system. Now, part of what's arisen in their place is what we call a right-wing ecosystem. And, obviously we have I'm sure we have differences of opinion among us in this virtual room that we're all sitting in. But the main point here is that we have, and this was 4 years ago, 70 hours of talk radio, 5 years ago, of talk radio across Wisconsin, 3 to 5 hours per major media market. So the state, in the same period that newspaper shrunk, became saturated with largely, almost exclusively, I should say, conservative to very, very conservative talk radio. During the 2010s, it was dominated by Charlie Sykes at WTMJ, and of course, he was syndicated throughout the state. So Charlie Sykes wasn't just on Milwaukee radio; he was a statewide figure. He shaped broader public opinion. We've interviewed Charlie, and he's not shy about this. He honed his messaging strategies with Governor Walker, who was a regular presence on the show. So one part of one political position, conservative republicanism, had a statewide news ecosystem, and the other one effectively didn't. Some people would say, well, the state journal is liberal, so it was, but it honestly, we can talk about that, but it really wasn't anything like a counterpart to the saturation of talk radio. And Sykes became the dominant component of conservative Twitter, as well as along with Paul Ryan. So, in summary, the macro news ecology has shifted significantly just in the past decade. Newspapers have declined and also been virtually, I shouldn't say monopolized, but oligopolized, which is leading to shrinking local coverage. Reporting on the state's been cut. Talk radio's filled the gap. And of course, as we all know today, and we could have spent an entire hour or more on this, social media amplifies the messages among partisan networks with, frankly, greater coherence on the right. And I have other data on that, which I decided not to try to introduce. But if you look at really briefly, we've studied the entire Twitter network of Wisconsin, and you see very coherent, few figures on the conservative side centered around Sykes when he was still on part of the state, Ryan, Governor Walker, and then much more diffusion on the, if you will, left or progressive side. So where does this leave people? Well, this is another, this is Don again, actually. I just realized there's 2 quotes from Don, but he says, I feel like 15 years ago, we were talking to some of these local Republican representatives and senators. They were listening to both sides. They were taking it all in. They were trying to make a decision on a consensus that what's right for a majority of people. How are we going to run a competent state government that helps everyone? And I just feel like some of that's gone, and I feel like that's on a national level too. It's so partisan politics that I don't know if we can get away from it. And again, this is not a lefty. He's a union member, but he's pretty moderate, even moderate, slightly conservative for conservative Democrat, if you will. So this is the way a lot of people in the state feel right now, and that's why I included this. We hear this from dozens and dozens and dozens of people of the hundreds that we've interviewed. I don't know why these firefighters in Fox Valley have a lot to say. I won't go through all this, but basically this is just the similar thing, that they're not reporting the news. We're not getting it. So that leaves, the main implications of this ecology summary are that the media of all sorts are no longer trusted source of local information. Although, and this is important, local newspapers and television remain among the most trusted sources in a world of declining trust. So even though most people don't trust anyone or anything, as you just heard, or very much, when they do, they still, in surveys that we've taken, have more trust in their local newspapers. Actually, local television, which I was a former local television producer in Wisconsin, so anything I say, you can and will be held against me. So basically, I can talk about local TV from the inside, but basically not sure it's worthy of the trust that people give it all the time, if I'm honest about it. I think it's also coverage has been shrinking and declining in quality and gotten thinner and thinner, but nonetheless, people do trust local TV. As I said, the single biggest gap, I'll come back to this when we talk about cable access in a few minutes. The single biggest gap in the entire state ecology now is information about state issues generally, because it's not coming from the state house, but particularly state representatives and senators. So people in the state, and this is to some extent, it's been true for a long time, but it's gotten much worse. People don't know who their state representatives and senators even are, much less what positions they take, often what party they are. And you can say, well, people make their own decisions. They vote with their feet, so to speak, about what they want to know about. And there's some truth to that. They don't want to know. But the sources of information, it used to be, you open the Racine Journal-Times and, 2-3 times a week, your local representative or senator voted on, a certain kind of bill and voted a certain way. And you could at least know that there was such a bill and who they were and how they voted and hold them accountable to some extent, at least in theory at the polls. Now that critical information link is basically broken. And finally, community information needs in general are not being adequately addressed. So now I'm going to pivot to that idea of community information needs. This is it's a copy of a book that we did based on the FCC study that Mary mentioned back in 2012. I led a study for the Federal Communications Commission surveying the landscape of local community information. Well, basically trying to ascertain, is there such a thing as community information needs, which, at one level you could say, sure, of course there are. And, it seems pretty self-evident in some ways, but this is a government agency. We needed to ascertain systematically, academically, do they exist? So we surveyed all of the literature that even discussed anything remotely around community information needs, thousands of articles actually in every field of social science, from the obvious ones, political science, sociology, to disaster research and health sphere and so on. So we, as I'll tell you in a minute, we discovered, or systematically, there are critical information needs in American communities. We asked how the media ecosystem operates to address them, and we asked what barriers exist to provide and meet to providing them and meeting them. That study, the FCC study, was supposed to turn into a national study or a series of pilot studies to figure this out more systematically in a series of different sized communities, different racial and ethnic composition across the United States. But it got spiked at the FCC when they finally decided the National Association of Broadcasters stepped in and said, hey, wait a minute, we don't want any national community information needs standards. And they got Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity involved as well. So it became a sort of little policy tempest in a teapot. So the study got spiked, but we went on and did this book to discuss what we found. And hopefully this will be back on the agenda at some point in the not super distant future. Let me just say one thing about that. I think that that COVID, obviously, which I won't get into in any depth, and we can talk about in Q&A if folks want. We've also done some studies of COVID misinformation in the state of Wisconsin. But basically, that if anything is exposed, that the fact that there are critical community information needs, not least of all broadband infrastructure, it's COVID. So what are these areas? Just, again, for most of you, these will be, I think, pretty obvious, even certainly intuitive. But what we found is that, again, surprise, people have community information needs in emergencies and risks, both immediate and long-term. And, again, while most people say, sure, of course they do, but the question is, how do we define those and are they being met? So, I'll just give you one example from our report. in Texas, as many of you know, radio stations stopped being required to carry news. News shrunk. There are large areas of Texas where there's people who primarily Spanish speakers. That's where they get most of their news and information, even though it's thin. But there was no 24-hour emergency radio in those areas. So if a tornado was coming, people literally wouldn't have any way of finding out about it. So sometimes it's this, these gaps we don't think about, but they're huge and have implications for people's lives. Health and welfare, including specifically local health information, as well as group-specific health information where it exists and is necessary. And one example of that is, as you all know, you can go on the web right now and pretty much find out about any condition from, the wart on your nose to why your big toe hurts and everything in between, right? But you may or may not be able to find out where the local well baby care is, or at least not find it very easily. So if you're a mother or parent who needs to get care for your kid, and maybe you're low income, finding out what exists in, Superior or what exists in Kenosha may be pretty difficult to actually do. Education, particularly as, school choice arose, which different positions on that as well. And I won't express my own view, but in any case, the predicate of school choice is that everybody knows what the schools in their communities are doing, right? So it's like schools are like a marketplace, and I'm a parent and I can choose the best school for my kid. Well, to choose the best school for my kid, I actually have to know something about the ranking of those schools, what those schools are, what they do, what they teach, what their quality is. Well, in almost every community in the United States, including some of the largest ones, that information doesn't exist, right? It's not organized online. There's no provision. If it is, it's buried in some reports and studies. So there again, parents need practical, accessible, navigable information just to know, some cases, how to organize their kids' education. They're not getting it. Transportation, including local alternatives, costs, schedules, is surprisingly thin locally. Economic opportunities, job information. We sort of assume that, the web has taken that over, right? Monster.com is a place where everybody finds out about jobs now. Well, yeah, for one class of jobs it is. But of course, the newspapers used to fill that gap with the local classifieds. So people who wanted, lower wage work, service work, and so on, find out from the newspaper. Now, yes, I know there's a job shortage right now, but there hasn't been always in the last decade, and there probably won't be again at some point in the future. Finding out about the full array of local job and employment opportunities is not very easy to do in most places. The environment, air and water quality, access to recreation, again, often scattered across dozens of portals, if they're organized in portals at all. Civic information, the availability of civic institutions, opportunities to get together with other people across a wide variety of interests. Again, it's often, if you Google soccer and Madison, you'll find something. And so I don't want to overstate this, but again, you have to kind of be able to search and know what you're searching for and have access to broadband to do it. And finally, political information, especially information about candidates in local government. And I think here's again a place where local cable access could play a critical, even more critical role. Information about local public policy and initiatives affecting communities and neighborhoods. And this is among the thinnest layers of all. Newspapers have drawn back. Television never covered this because it was too hyper-local. And I think, again, this is a huge information gap in local community information needs. So basically, what do we find? There is an identifiable set of community information needs that Americans need to navigate their everyday lives. People need them in order to survive and thrive. Low income and some minority and marginalized communities in both metro and rural areas, we term low information access areas, are likely to be systematically disadvantaged in both personal and community opportunities when these needs go unmet. And again, COVID just lays this bare, right, where kids are having to sit outside of a fast food franchise or maybe the local library if they're lucky, you know, in order to do their homework at night because they don't have broadband, the library's closed. I mean, this just makes it clear. And of course, it's not just about cities and it's not just about low-income people in cities. It's also about, you know, rural areas, large swaths of rural and exurban areas, of which Wisconsin has quite a few, right? And finally, we still don't really know enough about how these needs are being met in real Americans' lives in a wide variety of communities. So those studies that were going to be done are never, you know, were done piecemeal. We've done some. My colleagues in this an FCC project have done some, but that's still a patchwork at best. So what are the implications for the cable access community, at least as far as I see them? You know, I just want to, at some level, this is pretty obvious. I realize that. And I know that you are the ones who are out there, and I mean this sincerely, having been on the other side of this, struggling every day, trying to keep your funding, trying to keep things going, trying to get publicize your work, get viewership. I know that you know pretty much everything what I'm about to say, but I thought it might be a jumping off point for a discussion if we have time for that. So one implication of the community information needs issue is that the gap is as great as ever for two apparently contradictory reasons, but they're not really. One is, as I said before, there's such a proliferation of information on the net that while we can find out something about almost anything, local community information itself remains extremely difficult to locate. It's poorly organized, it's scattered. So you can find out about specific things, but not about a domain that you may need to know about, like education, for example, what's going on in my community. And so there still are, despite the proliferation of information on a sort of ad hoc basis, there's still major gaps in the community information supply, and especially in the infrastructure. And of course, cable access is an important part of that infrastructure. PEG channels still have a critical role to play, again, obvious to all of you, in both the local communication ecology, and I think in particular about educating the public about both government and community information needs. And I think that that's, that's an important selling point. A lot of people, legislators in particular, policymakers, local decision makers as well, somehow believe that because the internet is out there that anybody can get everything that they want or need. It's not true, right? It's just not true. And there's strong academic research that supports this, that there are large gaps, as I've just said, and navigating that environment is extremely difficult. So there's still a critical role to play for PEG channels locally. And the largest single gap, frankly, as I said before, is news about local state representatives and senators. Who are they? What are they doing? What issues? So that's an area where I think there's a huge public service to be done. And, I'm not going to pretend that, viewership will spike when your local representative is on your air necessarily, but I do think you can build some audience around that potentially for the most engaged citizens in your community. So cable access still has that critical roles in a community information hub. Now, having said that, right now, for better or worse, and I think it's worse, I'll be blunt about it, Facebook has become one of the most important sources of local news circulation. So that's, of course, again, as many of you know, all of you know, probably Facebook is a primary source of competition for any medium, right? Facebook and other social media. The younger you get, the more complex the social environment gets, of course. But Facebook in particular, there's some good research coming out of some folks at Michigan State now and some other people out in New Jersey who've done some good work on this that show that Facebook's kind of like displacing local news sources, more and more people. Where'd you see this? I saw it on Facebook. I heard it on Facebook. And that's where local news is starting to come from. There's a lot we could say about that. How much we could do about it is a very large question, an open question. But, you know, Facebook is an important source of that local news. And it's frankly, of course, your competition, which again, I think most of you know. Even in this environment, I think cable access has an important role to play, but navigating that role is more complicated pretty much every single year. And I think, you know, apropos the Facebook and other social based habits of most people, it's going to require strategies to integrate with local web and social media in ways that probably we still need to discover yet. So I'll stop now, and I think we're supposed to run till 1:45, and hopefully that'll give us some time for questions if there are any.
You have the Bill Donahue microphone somewhere? Okay.
You're getting feedback, Alan.
Does it work?
Can you hear her?
Can you hear that?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great.
Any questions?
You can hear me. Good. Based on what you're saying and the areas that you said here are the gaps, would you mind recapping the gaps and then perhaps give your opinion of how we might want to approach that?
Sure. I think
only because that might be the way, right, that we reach viewers and audiences that is not being needs that are not being met.
Yeah, I'm going to just quickly screen share again, if that's okay, if folks don't mind too much PowerPoint. When I first started, when I reached a point in lecturing where I didn't use PowerPoint and all my students started demanding it. So I've gotten used to it. But anyway, so these needs are all gaps. Now, obviously, emergencies is not an area that local cable access can play a particularly forward role, although it can in informing people about opportunities and infrastructure. I think there's a lot of health and welfare opportunity for local cable access. People, really, and I mean, the well baby care is a good example, but there's, so many issues that don't get discussed anymore. You used to have local television. Yeah, it was in the Sunday morning slot, often early, but you had some local interview shows where, people would come on and talk about local needs in this area. Those are drying up too. I think education is critical to every community, and it has a built-in audience. People understand, I think there are opportunity, for example, to talk to, and again, obviously this depends on the structure of your programming and your resources. So I want to make it clear that I understand that there's a lot of variation there. But, to the extent that you can do programming around education, I think that's, an opportunity. Transportation, maybe less so, but it depends where there are local transportation issues. I do think information about jobs, job training, and small business assistance is still an opportunity that people care about, as is information about the environment. The civic information is as broad almost as the community itself. Clearly, local clubs, local sports, local voluntary organizations are always an opportunity for some kind of programming. And finally, I do think that, and I know this is what a lot of you are doing right now too, political information about local governance and public policy provides an opportunity. And again, I don't want to be, I've been there. I know resources are limited. I know that, I publish a local online website in a news site in Madison through this J School, where we have student reporters, and but we report on the larger community. We're not we sort of effectively ban university stories. We want students out covering the Madison community broadly, and it's hard to do that reporting. I understand, even at a relatively I don't want to say superficial, but just to get basic stories out. But I will say this, like where, for example, we covered local meetings with the school superintendent, in this case, one with the Latino community. This is a few years ago. We had 10,000 hits from that story, and none of the local television didn't cover that. The local newspapers didn't cover it. But at that layer of the grassroots, right, where people, were concerned about their local schools or their, in this case, the Latino community and the superintendent, people cared about it. I mean, that story popped, and other similar stories have too. But I think that's an example of, again, easy for me to say, but organizing programming around those kinds of core issues that people really do care about and that are undercovered, I think provide a potential opportunity. And I also think, of course, and I'm sure you're all doing this now too, increasingly, having the ability to stream that content in various ways, to multi-purpose it, which also both, builds audience for your live television work and allows you to get more value out of anything that you produce. I think using social is an important element. I think having a social media strategy, ironically, for local cable television access is probably more critical now than it ever has been. Every one of you, and I will say this because I've learned this through hard experience for myself, just for our Madison Commons project needs a Facebook page, needs a Twitter account, probably, unfortunately. It needs to be using that whole range of media to reach out to your local community. But I think that's the way that now that people find out. But if people come to your coverage that way, I think you can build steady, potentially new, not huge, but I think potentially quite loyal audiences.
Anyone else?
I thought the visualization of the web of communication between newspapers and broadcast media, social media networks, and all of that, and just imagining where cable access fits into that, or where our community media stations fit into that. And I think you're sort of getting at that a little bit in your last response. But it's interesting to me because you think about the kinds of stories that get a lot of attention are the ones that are rather provocative or get people's emotions going or something like that. And we tend to specialize in sort of the bland, sort of straight news, or, straight on coverage of a council meeting, or this is our policy or something like that. I guess I'm just wondering how we, without changing who we are and our kind of straight up coverage, how do we get attention from these other, like you said, covering some of these needs, of course, would make a difference. But I wonder if there's any other way we could kind of, catch the eye of the audience with the kind of work we do.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do understand that, you're not going to juice up your local council meetings. You're not supposed to, and you'd probably get in trouble if you did. And I'm not sure that you could. You'd have to work pretty hard. But I do think one area that might, this is just one idea, and again, I'm sure you've all thought of this and other things. Pre-promotion, I think, can be helpful, especially for issues that, even something as simple as like zoning, right? Which again, relatively few people care about, but if there's a big, development going in or something new happening, people are probably not going to find you in real time. by the time, it's on 7 o'clock on a Wednesday night and the council is meeting, people are not going to randomly tune into that. I mean, some are, but not that many. But if there's a way to begin to pre-promote some of those issues built around, whatever, however you understand your community information needs and what you're finding locally, if there is a set of questions around the school and there's going to be a school board hearing about it, pushing that out well in advance, days in advance, a week in advance, using social, I think is a way of pre-promoting your work. And then again, streaming it out afterward and making it clear to people that if you missed it, on Wednesday night, that it's still here. So I think there's a pre-promotion and a post-promotion strategy that might be able to be used, so that the bread and butter coverage that many of you do, and that's your mandate, I understand, and I'm glad you do it because somebody has to do it. It's important, but you might get both bigger pre and post, well, not pre audiences, but build up for the event and then gain post from the event. And that does require social media strategy. And I understand, social media, I happen to think it's a giant pain personally. I barely keep up with my email, but having said that, it's a necessity. So, how do you do that while you're busy, managing a facility and taking calls from council people? I get that that's not an easy thing to do, to add one more thing to your plate, but I do think it needs to be done. One thing we've done, and I don't know if this is an opportunity, maybe to create an internship for a local high school kid or college, depending on where you're at, and have a social media intern. We found, that obviously, to state the blindingly obvious, kids understand social media, college students in my case, much better than most of us do. And furthermore, they actually have ideas and time to do it. And for them to build up a line on their college resume or build up a line for a work resume as a social media intern, even if it's unpaid or barely paid, might be something that would allow you to get more push locally, without, and again, you have to supervise interns too, so that's not cost free, but that's a one way maybe of building up a social media strategy for fairly low cost.
I did, oh, there's no one? Okay.
Yeah, microphone's there.
I did want to point out, and maybe working, hello, okay. A lot of our municipalities really did have in emergency communications, especially during the pandemic and that kind of thing. So
I just cut out.
Yeah, I think it's. I want to echo the thing that Mary was saying about public health communication work amongst PEG channels across the country. There's a great study of this American University did that worth amplifying in terms of the vital role that all the organizations here and across the country play, done by Pat Ofterheide, Antoine Haywood, and Maria Sanchez, that was, I think, last September. I want to ask you a university-related question, because I just heard in a symposium on this issue about local information needs, the idea that universities could be leveraging work-study students to be able to partner with local organizations such as PEG facilities, to be able to build skills, increase labor force, to be able to create local content that's meaningful, and actually help the localities that universities are supposed to be helping under their charters. I mean, it's kind of an odd idea. The possibility of doing something like that in Wisconsin.
I'm sorry, are you done? I can't see. It's harder when I can't see.
Yeah, he's done.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, first of all, Pat Afterhigh is a good friend of mine, so I'm glad to hear that her. And I need to go find that study because I admit also that I didn't see it. Yeah, it's a great idea, and I don't know. And the short answer is, since I don't handle work study, I don't know. Some of you may have learned in your years in Wisconsin government that there's a lot of rules here. And they're very specific. So I'm sure that there are very specific rules in each university, each of the UWs, for what work study students can and can't do, and how much, to what extent their work study has to be internal to the university. But I don't know what those boundaries are. So that's just to be clear. I'm sure there are rules. I don't know what they are. But I will say this, and this doesn't help you because they pay for it themselves, but we've set up a extremely successful internship program between my organization, Madison Commons, which is basically just a unit of the J School, which is a unit of the UW, Madison, with the Community Shares of Wisconsin, which is statewide, but Madison-based kind of alternative United Way. And we've been providing them with social media interns, 5 or 6 a year for about 6-7 years now. And they've helped develop a social media strategy for them that they use in their big share that they raise up now, I think last view, $700,000 a year from that. And our social media interns have played an important role. So it's the work study issue specifically, that, that means somebody else is paying, which I know is desirable. I can't speak to that, but where you have a local UW, where you have a UW in your area, it's worth, especially if there's a journalism or a communication program, I would get in touch with those folks and say, is it possible to do that? Are there opportunities that are paid to help us and help us help you by training your students and giving them real world experience? So it's a great idea. I don't know what the rules are, but I support the idea.
Yeah, hi, this is Boyce Johnson. I'm with the city of Madison, and that's the city channel. We did, up until I think around 2013, use work study pretty extensively from UW as well as MATC, and I think even Edgewood. And then briefly Madison Media Institute, while it existed, we had a little bit of a partnership with them. We are looking at going back to using work study. It was a great program. The city picked up half of it. The school picked up the other half. So we're definitely looking at returning to it. I think it's a great program, and it's really useful on both ends.
That's great. That's good. I mean, thank you, and nice to meet you. That's terrific. And again, a huge opportunity to for many things, but particularly for social media, because if you can get a college kid for a year, especially one who's paid and semi-responsible, they're all responsible, but who's paid, that would be fantastic. Yeah.
All right. It looks like we're out of time.
Okay.
Wrap up.
Yep.
Yeah, it's Mary. Thank you very, very much for coming. We really appreciate it. I think we all learned some very interesting things about the media ecology in the state and the needs of our communities. And let's give Professor Friedland a round of applause.